In such an epoch, absolute art makes its appearance. Prior to this, it is an instinctive fashioning of material, submerged in the world of determinate being. It works its way out of it and into it. It does not possess its substance in the free ethical sphere, and therefore does not have the character of free spiritual activity for the self at work. Later on, spirit transcends art in order to gain a higher representation of itself, that is, to be not merely the substance born of the self, but to be in its representation as object, this self, not only to give birth to itself from its notion, but to have its very notion for its shape, so that the notion and the work of art produced know each other as one and the same. Paragraph 702 is a very short one coming on the heels of a very long one where Hegel has introduced all of this discussion of the religion of the ethical spirit and what that means in terms of its artwork. And here there's a good bit going on in this short paragraph about the development of what spirit as concerned with art, and as he's going to call it, absolute art, is going to be bringing to the table. And he's drawing a comparison between what went before, which is what we saw as religion engaging through the artwork, through the artificer, the worker, him or herself, working upon physical objects, creating something that could be the object, say, of a cult, of a religion, of a form of worship. So he talks about this as being an epoch. So we have something new here. We've already commented on the fact that Hegel is very Hellenocentric, and it's the Greeks that are really doing something important with respect to this, and they're sort of the paradigm. And that makes sense. And we could expand this if we want to follow out Hegel's reasoning to better understandings of the works of art of many other cultures as well. But he's talking about this as being an epoch, and it's that word in both German and in the English translation. We have a new period of time, a new culture, a new history happening, a transition. And he says, absolute art makes its appearance. Now, this is very important. It's not absolute art comes on the scene completely formed and we know exactly what it is, we recognize it, and we say, oh, we're in a new historical period. History doesn't work quite like that, right? Instead, spirit is always working behind the scenes, and it's working behind the scenes specifically in terms of this artistic production. So he wants to draw this contrast, as we said. And here, Miller, the translation, I would say, leaves a little bit to be desired. He talks about this being an instinctive fashioning of material. Oh, okay, that's not too bad, Instinktartige Arbeiten. Arbeiten is working, laboring, developing, taking, makes sense that Miller's reading material into that, because what do you in fact work upon, and what do you make, say, idols out of, or ceremonial masks, or temples, or whatever it's going to be, statuary, all that kind of interesting stuff. Arbeiten has to work upon that. And this is something that is really central to human beings. We are workers of things, and also of ourselves, of course. Instinktartige, right? So instinctive, artige of the type, of the genre, of the classification. Okay, we can call this instinctual. It's not totally a matter of instinct, of course, because, the Werkmeister, the Arbeiter, the worker in this case, is not just some, dumb ant or something like that, right? But it's not as spirit-filled, we could say, as what's coming next. And then he says that submerged into the world of determinate being. All right, well, this is ins Dasein, and so you've got to read quite a bit into call Dasein, existence, being there, the world of determinate being. But let's go along with Miller's translation and Hegel and see where this is going. I think that, there could be an argument for why talking about determination, right, as opposed to absolute. The absolute seemingly is unlimited, right? It's not contained, enclosed, determinate in that way. So what do we have instead? He tells us, here we go. Well, let's finish this out. It works its way out of it and into it. It works its way in and out of existence. It does not possess its substance in the free ethical sphere, right? So that's what it's telling us we don't have at this stage, then we do have that at this stage, right? So he says, it does not have the character of free spiritual activity for the self at work. And so what are we seeing here? A greater amount of freedom to produce a different kind of determinacy that's not just determined by the material that you've got in front of you or some vague command. It's more self-conscious. It's more able to take a creative role in the forming. And so let's keep this ethical sphere in the front of our mind. He says, later on, spirit transcends art in order to gain a higher representation of itself. That's what we're depicting here with these different levels. To be what? Not merely the substance born of the self. Now, what does that mean? To be not merely the substance born of the self means that, well, it is also the substance born of the self. So don't forget that. Don't say, oh, we're not having that. We're negating that. No, it is the substance born of the self. And that substance born of the self is connected with and finds itself within this ethical sphere, Sittlichkeit, right? Or das Sittliche, or however we want to frame it. The realm of, you can call it ethos, or mores, or customs, or the free people that has divided itself up into all of its different functions. All of that is what the self as substance, as the substance born of it is discovering it. And all of that is a way in which spirit is coming to know itself. But then we go beyond that, right? Spirit is developing a representation, Darstellung, not Vorstellung here, Darstellung, right? It's providing something set out in front of it, something that's set out there. So he says, later spirit transcends art in order to gain a higher representation of itself, right? To be in its representation as object, as Gegenstand. So we've got this notion of putting something outside of itself or beyond itself so that it can thereby figure out what it is. The artist, the Künstler, who is producing, I mean, unless they're a performance artist, and even performance artists have stuff, don't they, right? Or, they're doing something just purely cognitive in their mind, or maybe they're an artist of affectivity. No, artists generally are putting something outside of themselves that is coming from themselves and represents something for them, but it's also connected with what they've freely chosen to turn the eye or the ear or the inspiration, the mind to. So, representation as object. This is important as well. And he says that, here we go, not only to give birth to itself from its notion, right? So we've got a notion, a concept, a Begriff, and it can give birth to itself according to this notion, but here it's actually taking charge of the notion. It's taking care of the notion. It's making it its own. He says, to have its very notion for its shape, its Gestalt, its shape of what? Of consciousness. And then he says, so that the notion and the work of art, Kunstwerk, the thing that has been produced, know each other as one and the same. Now, isn't that an interesting thing to say? So it's easy to picture what it means for spirit or the person or the artist, even if we do it in this very abstract sense of the notion as shape, right? The shape of the artist, the shape of consciousness, the notion that they embody. There's a personality there, and it's easy to say they know themselves as the same as the work of art that's been generated. It's easy to say what that means. What does it mean to go the other way? To say that the work of art itself knows what the worker, the artist, the intention, the spirit animating it. How does that know? It's not a person now, is it? Well, that's where we're heading, isn't it? So we don't actually have to resolve this at this point because we're going to do that in the next section to come. The ethical substance, having withdrawn from its outer existence back into its pure self-consciousness, this is the aspect of the notion or of the activity with which spirit brings itself forth as object. This activity is pure form because the individual in ethical obedience and service has worked off every unconscious existence and fixed determination in the same way that substance itself has become this fluid essence. This form is the night in which substance was betrayed and made itself into subject. It is out of this night of pure certainty of self that the ethical spirit is resurrected as a shape freed from nature and its own immediate existence. Paragraph 703 is another short paragraph in which there's quite a lot going on that's important for this transition that we're seeing to the cusp where we're going to get into some more determinate content and movement with the abstract work of art, and then the real centerpieces of this, the later sections or subsections within this religion in the form of art section. And so he talks about ethical substance, right? Substance is just substance, and then ethical in all of this is Sittliche. So the ethical substance having withdrawn from its outer existence. What is its outer existence? Well, it's Dasein. It's existence as such. And we're seeing that this is going to be mediated in large part through the individual who's been so important in the reason and spirit section. This is practical. Something is happening here. So he says, this ethical substance has withdrawn from its outer existence back into its pure self-consciousness. And this is as he says, the aspect, or the side, literally, die Seite, of the notion, the Begriff. So pure self-consciousness is, this polarity that the individual, him or herself, has. What individual are we talking about here? Well, he doesn't tell us in this, but if we look ahead a bit, it is both the individual who is the worker of art, and it is also the individual or individuals depicted within the works of art, because we're moving gradually in the later subsections of this into considering human beings, considering gods who are like human beings and are, to jump ahead a little bit, freed from nature and their immediate existence in ethical life and its predicaments. So he tells us that this is the aspect of the notion or the activity, the Tätigkeit, the doing things, right? It's not just a single deed, it's the capacity to do, the activity, the action, he says, with which spirit brings itself forth as object. What do we mean there? Well, in the previous paragraph, the development that's taking place, it involves spirit engaging in Darstellung, sticking something out there, actually something out of itself, a bit of itself, that it can then recognize as Gegenstand, as standing against it as imposing itself. And this is a way in which spirit can recognize itself, which, remember, is what religion is all about for Hegel, right? So he says that this activity is pure form. So we've got pure now in two different ways: pure self-consciousness, pure form. Why? And here's where we get to something really interesting. So it's not just this notion or spirit through its activity generating a pure form. We also have the individual coming out of their outer existence through the aspect of the notion and through some things that they're doing. What does the activity look like? The activity is ethical Zittliche, obedience and service, Gehorsam, Dienste. Where have we seen those words come up before? Well, the first time was in the dialectic of master and slave, and then, we saw we had no resolution really there, We had to go into Stoicism, skepticism, unhappy consciousness, the reason section, and then we got to spirit, where we have, again, dialectic of self-consciousnesses facing each other within culture now, though, trying to make sense out of their relations to each other, which are supposed to lead them to have some sort of recognition, a mutual recognition, right? So now, through ethical obedience and service, what does that have to do with art? Are we talking about an apprenticeship here? No, we're talking about what has been depicted. What is the object, the Gegenstand of art? And again, we're not going to get into that right in the first subsection, but by the second one, we're definitely there. So ethical obedience and service leads us to a subject rather than just a substance. He says, the individual in ethical obedience and service has worked off every unconscious existence and fixed determination in the same way that substance itself has become this fluid essence. What is this fluid essence? The subject. Now here is where Hegel brings in some other interesting things to formulate this with, right? He says, this form is the night in which substance was betrayed and made itself into subject. So something new has developed here through this betrayal, through this finding something more, a surplus there than what was originally brought. It looks as if at every point, right, we go from determinacy to pure self-consciousness, pure this, pure that, and that's very abstract, and it's hard to tell what that is. Well, by doing that, by exerting the force of the negative, as Hegel called it way, way back in the preface, we find that we have substance transformed into subject again. And he tells us that it is out of this night of what? Pure certainty of self. We've seen that many times through the previous dialectics as well, haven't we? This night of pure certainty of self where it is betrayed, that ethical spirit is resurrected. It stood back up, right? As what? As a shape, Gestalt, freed from nature and its own immediate existence, unmittelbares Dasein, right? These aspects, its pure contingent existence, we could say, but also from nature. Now, why is it important to be freed of nature? Isn't nature where we got our raw materials from? Isn't nature where we got our ideas for, the shapes and forms and images that we ought to work with? Yes. So that's very important. Hegel isn't saying get rid of nature. He is saying transcend nature. Culture, and religion in this case, is greater than what is merely natural. This is something that has been known for a very, very long time. It is not something merely modern. I mean, we can see this already back in, for example, Simplicius in his commentary on Epictetus's Enchiridion. Simplicius was a Neoplatonic philosopher who says that in his commentary on Epictetus is talking about proiresis, the faculty of choice, the thing that is, definitive of us, that is reflexive, like spirit, that proiresis transcends nature. It goes beyond just what nature, which was so important for those ancients, can provide. So this is a really important humanistic theme, we could say. And you might say, well, what does that got to do with religion then? Well, we have to sort of wait and see where this is going to be headed. But what we have here is a dynamic playing off of the previous paragraph, helping us to understand better what happened in that very long paragraph where Hegel waxed forth in 701 about the religion of the ethical spirit, bringing all of that stuff into play. The concrete existence of the pure notion into which spirit has fled from its body is an individual which spirit selects to be the vessel of its sorrow. Spirit is present in this individual as his universal and as the power over him from which he suffers violence, as his pathos, by giving himself over to which his self-consciousness loses its freedom. But that positive power of universality is subdued by the pure self of the individual, the negative power. This pure activity, conscious of its inalienable strength, wrestles with the shapeless essence. Becoming its master, it has made the pathos into its material and given itself its content, and this unity emerges as a work, universal spirit, individualized and set before us. With paragraph 704, we round out this introductory section to religion in the form of art, and we're getting ready to move into the abstract work of art and the other subsections that follow, each of which is going to get more and more involved. And Hegel is doing some prefiguration here of what is yet to come. He tells us that the concrete existence, and that is existence, not Dasein, notice. And so does it make sense to translate it as concrete existence? I would say yes. We certainly want to demarcate it from Dasein, which has been used in the previous paragraphs to talk about the contingent existence, right? The concrete existence of the pure notion, the Begriff that we saw assuming importance in the last two paragraphs here, into which spirit has fled from its body. Now, isn't that an interesting term to bring up? It's Körper. Does spirit really have a body? Well, I guess it does if spirit is taking possession of people or expressing itself through determinate human beings. Or this could be, like the contrast between the body and the spirit itself. Maybe Hegel's playing off of that. In any case, he tells us it's fled from its body, so there's a movement going on here into its concrete existence. And what is that concrete existence? It is an individual. And then here he says something really quite interesting. So there's a metaphor here. The vessel of its sorrow or its suffering, right? Spirit is selecting an individual, not every individual, but an individual, as the vessel, what? Of its promise, of its elevation? No, of its suffering, of its sorrow, of its sadness. It selects that individual on what basis? Hegel doesn't tell us here. We'll find that out as we get into more determinate stories and other ways of understanding art. But these are going to involve stories. So he says, spirit is present in this individual as his universal. Well, that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? To have spirit as the universal in you? Yes and no. In this case, it's actually not that good. Not that good for the individual in a certain way, except that they can be elevated. They are being picked out, selected. They are being made essential. They are being made key characters, right? But that universal, as Hegel says, as the universal and as the power over him, the force, the Gewalt, the violence from which he suffers violence, as his pathos, by giving himself over to which his self-consciousness loses its freedom. What is Hegel talking about here? Is he talking about the artist who is working on a work of art and it's so difficult and they pour so much of themselves into it? Not really. He's talking more here, again, about character, about individuals who are taken maybe out of history or out of the stories that we tell ourselves and build into epics or whatever other cultural productions we're making of them, in this case, the cultural productions of the ancient Greeks. And Spirit is making that person suffer as an individual, but also as the representative of the universal, as being somebody, being something that we can identify, whether it's Oedipus or his screwed up kids who result from that, including Antigone, or whether it's Theseus, or whether it's pick anyone you want, right? So he goes on and he says, well, actually, let's pause on this for a moment. Suffers violence as his pathos. So what is pathos? Pathos is literally suffering. We also use it in ancient Greek to denote the emotions that are things that are responses, right, to provocations, to things happening to us, whether they're good or bad emotions. It's also an element, you could say, of drama. To have pathos means that the thing that's happening, we feel our way into it. We respond to that character and their pathos. And then he says, giving himself over to which his self-consciousness, pure self-consciousness we saw before, loses its freedom. It becomes stuck in the fabric of its choices, its determinacy, right? So he goes on and he says that positive power of universality is subdued by what? The pure self of the individual, the negative power, the indeterminacy, the capacity to revolt, to say no, if we want to take sort of a Camusian way of looking at this, the capacity to build something, to try something, to do something else, which is a negation of the positive. There's different kinds of negation we can talk about. They're not all the same. Not every negative is the same. And what Hegel depicts here actually looks quite positive, what the individual does, how they do this. He says, this pure activity, conscious of its inalienable strength, wrestles with the shapeless essence that was talked about in the previous paragraphs, right? What is this pure activity, this pure Tätigkeit, conscious of its inalienable strength? Is that on the side of the universal, or is that on the side of the individual? It's the individual, in this case, doing that. So he says, becoming its master. And here he says, Meister, right? So this goes back to like the Werkmeister and the, Künstler, the artist. It has made the pathos into its material, Stoff, things to be used. It's supply, you could even say, right? It turned that pathos, what it was suffering, it transformed it into something intelligible, something that is meaningful. And he says it's given itself its content. And this unity emerges as a work. Now, what is this a unity of? Universal spirit, individualized. The unity of the universal and the individual, right? But it's the individual who carries this out and set before us. This is one of the objects of the work of art that is going to play an important role in religion. And now we're ready to move into the next subsection.